They said the pale girl brought bad luck to the river, that when she walked by, the water turned still and the wind forgot to move. No one ever asked her name. They just called her Trouble. Her mother kept her hidden most days, curtains drawn, windows shut, so the neighbors wouldn't stare. But at dusk, when the light turned soft and grey, the girl would slip out barefoot and walk down to the marsh. She'd watch her reflection in the water, the pale shimmer of her hair blending with the fog. It was the only time she felt like she belonged anywhere. Until the night the preacher's little girl followed her there and didn't come back. After that, no one saw Iris Whitlow again. Only the river, calm, quiet, and waiting. This is the story of the girl they blamed for what the world refused to understand. Before we begin, make sure you subscribe to the Macabre record and tell me in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? Now, let's go back to Maryland, 1856. The river behind the Whitlow house didn't rush or roar, it breathed. Each morning, before the sun rose high enough to burn the fog away, Naomi Whitlow could hear it exhale through the reeds like a slow, tired sigh. The marsh had a voice of its own, and she'd learned to listen. That's how she kept her daughter safe. Iris was born in the month the herons came back, pale as their feathers and just as silent. Even when she laughed, rare as it was, it sounded like a sound the world wasn't supposed to notice. Her skin stayed white no matter how long the summer lasted, and her hair refused to turn gold like the other children's. The people in town had names for her. Naomi told her never to ask what they were. They lived in a small cottage on the edge of Fairgrove, Maryland. 2 rooms, 1 stove, a single mirror covered by cloth. Naomi took in laundry from town, scrubbing shirts and table linens until her hands turned raw. Iris hung them on the line, standing where the fog was thick enough to hide her from the road. She hummed while she worked, small songs with no words. Naomi told her to stop, afraid someone might hear. At dusk, when the marshlight softened to silver, Iris would slip outside barefoot, careful not to creak the boards. She'd walk down to the edge of the river, not to play, but to watch. The water didn't judge her. It rippled when she smiled and went still when she frowned. Some evenings she'd whisper to her reflection, "If I look like you, does that mean you're real too?" Naomi would find her later, whispering back toward the water, her small figure blurred by mist. She'd scold her gently, "Iris, come in now." The night ain't kind to those who shine. But Iris always lingered one moment longer, waiting for her reflection to fade completely before she turned away. Fairgrove was a quiet town, too quiet to forgive curiosity. People there didn't need proof to make up their minds, just something different to look at. They'd seen Iris only a few times, and that was enough. A store clerk had crossed himself when she reached for change. A child had cried when she passed by. And every Sunday, Naomi sat in the back pew of Reverend Bell's church, feeling the weight of every eye that didn't look directly at her. In a town like Fairgrove, silence was both protection and curse. Naomi thought if she could keep her daughter hidden long enough, the whispers might forget her. But whispers, once they find a name, don't die. They wait. And down by the marsh, Iris's reflection was still listening. The first time the people of Fairgrove truly saw Iris Whitlow, the morning fog hadn't yet lifted. Naomi needed to deliver a fresh batch of laundry to the parsonage before the Sunday bell rang, and she'd decided to bring Iris with her, partly for company, mostly because she couldn't bear to leave her alone again. They walked the dirt road that cut through the wheat fields, the hem of Naomi's skirt damp with dew. Iris kept to her mother's shadow, holding a bundle of folded linens almost as tall as herself. Her bonnet was too big, the brim falling low over her pale eyes. When the first wagon passed, the driver slowed to stare. Naomi nodded politely. The man didn't nod back. Fairgrove was small, 1 church, 1 store, and a handful of houses where gossip travelled faster than wind. By the time Naomi reached the parsonage, she could already feel the shift in the air, curtains moving, quiet conversations breaking mid-word. Reverend Cyrus Bell's wife opened the door. Her face froze in polite shock. "You brought help?" she asked, her eyes flicking toward the small figure beside Naomi. "My daughter," Naomi said softly. "She won't be any trouble." Iris kept her head down, studying the way sunlight scattered through the porch slats. But when she lifted her eyes, she saw a little girl about her age peeking from behind the door frame. Brown curls, blue ribbons, a face full of curiosity. Annie Bell. The two children looked at each other the way mirrors do, both unsure what they were seeing. Annie tilted her head, smiling. Iris almost smiled back. Almost. "Annie," her mother snapped, "inside." The door closed, leaving the smell of soap and damp linen between them. Naomi turned to leave, whispering, "Keep walking, Iris. Don't look back." But Iris did, just once. She saw Annie still watching from the window, pressing her small hand to the glass. Iris raised hers in return, palm to palm, separated by the reflection. When they returned home, Naomi's silence filled the cottage thicker than fog. "You'll stay inside this week," she said finally. "People talk." "I didn't say a word," Iris whispered. "I know," Naomi sighed. "That's why they're afraid of you." That evening, as the church bell echoed across the marsh, Iris thought about the girl behind the window, about the way she'd smiled without fear. It was the first time she wondered if maybe someone could see her, not the way others did, but as she really was. Down the road, inside the parsonage, Annie Bell told her father about the white-haired girl who waved at her through the glass. The Reverend didn't smile. He only asked, "Did she say anything to you?" "No," Annie said. "She just looked lonely." The Reverend nodded, slowly closing his Bible. "Then you stay away from her, child. The Lord marks some things to be left alone." The church bell always sounded different on Sundays, sharper, hungrier somehow. Naomi could hear it through the thin walls of their cottage, echoing across the marsh like a reminder. She stood by the basin, wringing out the last of the linens, while Iris sat at the window tracing shapes in the fog. "Put your bonnet on," Naomi said softly. "We'll sit in the back." She didn't go to church out of devotion. She went so the people of Fairgrove wouldn't say she'd stopped. When you were already on the edge of things, staying home only gave them more to whisper about. The church was small and white, its paint peeling in long strips. The pews smelled of polish and damp wood. Naomi sat near the back, head bowed, eyes down. Iris sat beside her, clutching a worn hymnal too tightly. When Reverend Bell stepped to the pulpit, his voice filled the room like smoke. He preached about order and purity, about the unnatural things that test a believer's faith. "The Lord's creations are perfect," he said, "and what is born outside his design is not his work, but his warning." Naomi's chest tightened. She didn't have to look up to know where his eyes fell. The air seemed to bend toward her and Iris. Someone coughed. Someone else muttered, "Amen." Iris didn't understand most of it, but she could feel the room change. The air grew heavier, the silence sharper after every word the Reverend spoke. She stared at her hands in her lap, so pale they almost blended into the folds of her dress. When the service ended, Naomi stood quickly, pulling her daughter close. But they didn't make it far before Mrs. Bell, the preacher's wife, stopped them at the door. "You might want to keep the girl indoors," she said gently, though her smile was thin. "There's been talk." "You know how people get," Naomi managed a nod. "I know," she said, her voice low. As they walked home, the whispers followed. "She looks like something born half in shadow," someone said. Another murmured, "Poor thing," or "Poor mother." Naomi gripped Iris's hand tighter. The child said nothing, though her eyes flicked to the sky where blackbirds gathered on the fence rails. She wondered if they were listening too. That night, Naomi didn't light the lamp. She sat at the table with her hands folded, whispering prayers she half remembered. Iris listened from her small bed, the words soft and broken, more begging than belief. Through the cracked window, the river's voice drifted in, slow, steady, patient. It never called her names, and in that dark silence, Iris decided she liked the river's prayers better than the church's. By late summer, the days in Fairgrove grew heavy and still. The air over the marsh felt thick enough to hold a breath forever. That was when Iris began slipping away again. She waited until her mother's lamp went out, until the house sank into that soft, creaking silence that meant Naomi had fallen asleep. Then Iris would lift the latch and step into the cool dark. The marsh at dusk was her world, reeds whispering secrets, frogs croaking like old men, the steady pulse of the river stretching wide and silver beneath the moon. She went there not to hide, but to see herself. In the glassy surface, her reflection floated like another child, pale, fragile, but calm, the only one who never flinched when she met her gaze. Sometimes she whispered to the water, not prayers exactly, just small thoughts she couldn't tell her mother. "They don't like me," she'd say, "but you don't mind, do you?" The ripples would move softly like an answer. She started bringing little things to the river, wildflowers, fallen feathers, a bit of ribbon she found snagged on a fence. She'd drop them in and watch them drift away, pretending they were the words she never got to speak aloud. Back at the cottage, Naomi would wake suddenly, sensing the emptiness beside her bed. Panic sharpened her heartbeat. Every night she'd find Iris kneeling near the bank, her pale hair glowing faintly in the dark. Every night she'd pull her away and scold her in a whisper. "You don't belong down here, child. Folks see you near this water. They'll start saying it's cursed again." Iris never argued. She just looked back toward the river, lips parted as if to tell it goodbye. One evening, the light lingered longer than usual. Naomi stood at the door, arms crossed, watching her daughter through the drifting mist. For the first time, she noticed how peaceful Iris looked there, how the marsh seemed to quiet around her. And for a moment, Naomi wondered if maybe the child wasn't drawn to the water out of defiance, but because that was the only place the world's cruelty couldn't reach her. When Iris finally came inside, Naomi brushed the damp hair from her forehead. "Promise me," she said softly, "you won't go there again." "I promise," Iris whispered. But as she lay in bed that night, she could still hear the river breathing, slow, patient, calling her name without sound. It was a Sunday evening when Iris first saw the preacher's little girl by the river. The sun had already dipped low, the sky fading from gold to grey. Iris was kneeling by the water's edge, tracing circles in the shallows with a stick, when she heard someone giggle, light, quick, like the sound of a bell. She turned. There, half hidden among the reeds, stood Annie Bell. Her blue dress was too fine for the marsh, her shoes already wet and muddy, her curls sticking to her cheeks. Iris froze, unsure whether to run or speak. Annie smiled. "I followed you," she said simply, as though it were nothing strange. "You come here a lot." Iris didn't answer. She looked toward the path, expecting to see Reverend Bell or his wife, but no one was there. "My mama says you live by the water," Annie went on, taking another step closer. "She says you don't like people." Iris glanced back at the river. "The water likes me fine." That made Annie laugh again. She crouched beside her, dipping her hand into the river. "It's cold." "You shouldn't touch it," Iris whispered. "Why not?" "People think it listens." Annie tilted her head, curious. "To who?" Iris shrugged. "To whoever talks first." They sat like that for a long time. Two small girls, one glowing pale in the twilight, the other bright as a lantern beside her. Annie began humming softly, a tune her father often led in church. Iris joined in, off-key but gentle, until their voices blended like the wind and the water. When they stopped, Annie looked at her and said, "You're not scary. You just look like snow." "I've never seen snow," Iris said. "It's soft," Annie told her, smiling. "It doesn't hurt anything." Iris didn't know what to say. No one had ever compared her to something kind before. As the light faded, Annie stood and brushed off her dress. "If my papa finds out I came here, he'll be mad," she said. "But I'll come back tomorrow." "Maybe we can play—" "You shouldn't," Iris said quickly, her voice trembling. "If they see you with me—" "I don't care," Annie interrupted, grinning. "You need a friend." And before Iris could answer, Annie was already running back through the reeds, leaving a trail of laughter behind her. When Naomi found Iris by the door that night, her dress damp, her shoes muddy, she asked where she'd been. Iris only said, "Now the river has two voices." Naomi frowned, her hands tightening around the laundry line she held. "Don't bring anyone there," she warned. "Not ever." But Iris's eyes were far away, still watching the ripples where another child's reflection had briefly joined hers. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel like the only one who wasn't afraid of the river. Naomi Whitlow noticed the change first in her daughter's eyes. Iris had always been quiet, but lately there was a brightness there, a secret flicker that didn't come from sunlight. When Naomi asked what she was smiling about, the girl said, "The river's not lonely anymore." At first, Naomi didn't understand, but the next evening when she went out to gather laundry, she saw two sets of footprints in the mud, one small, one smaller. Both led to the water and back again. Her heart turned cold. "Iris," she said later, keeping her voice steady, "you been talking to someone down there?" The child hesitated. "Her name's Annie. She likes the river too." Naomi dropped the cloth she was folding. "The preacher's girl?" Iris nodded, eyes wide and innocent. "She says I look like the moon." Naomi pressed a hand to her chest, as though she could still her racing heart by force. "You can't see her again, Iris. You hear me? That family—" She stopped, biting back the rest. "That family will destroy you." Iris lowered her head, her small fingers tightening around the edge of her dress. "But she's nice to me." "Nice don't mean safe," Naomi said. That night, after putting Iris to bed, she sat by the window long after the lamp had gone out. The marsh was still, the river breathing in slow, deep sighs. She could see the faint shimmer of the water in the distance, and for the first time she thought she saw movement there. Two shapes instead of one. The next morning, Naomi went into town to deliver laundry. She passed Reverend Bell on the road. He stopped, raising a hand in greeting. "Sister Whitlow," he said, "I trust your girl is well." Naomi's throat tightened. "She is." He smiled, but there was something hard behind it. "Annie speaks of her often. Children see things we don't they?" Naomi managed a small nod, then walked away as fast as her legs could carry her. That evening, she prayed longer than usual. Not because she believed the Lord would answer, but because silence was worse. "Don't let them notice her," she whispered. "Not the way they notice everything else." But Iris didn't hear her mother's prayer. She was at the river again, barefoot, her reflection joined by another. Annie was showing her how to braid grass into crowns, giggling every time the wind tried to steal one away. When the sun dipped behind the trees, Iris looked back at the house. For a moment she could have sworn she saw her mother watching from the window, a dark silhouette framed by the dim glow of the oil lamp. Naomi stood there a long time, hands pressed against the glass. She didn't wave, she didn't call out, she just whispered under her breath, "Lord, don't let the river take them both." By the time the summer broke, the air over Fairgrove had turned strange, heavy, expectant, as if the sky itself was waiting for something to go wrong. The heat came in waves that shimmered over the fields, the river shrinking back on itself until only thin veins of water shimmered among the reeds. People said the earth was being punished. Reverend Bell said it was a sign. Each week his sermons grew sharper, less about mercy and more about judgment. He spoke of pestilence, of unnatural creatures, and of God's patience wearing thin. Naomi could feel the meaning behind every word. She sat in the last pew, Iris's small hand folded inside her own, praying that the river wouldn't betray them by whispering their names. Outside the church, the whispers had already started. A farmer swore his horse had gone lame after Iris passed by. A woman claimed her milk curdled when she caught sight of the child's reflection in her window. And then came the fever. It started with the baker's son, then the schoolmaster's wife. Within a week, the churchyard bell tolled twice a day, long, low notes that carried across the marsh like a warning. Iris didn't understand the panic at first. She only knew her mother's hands had begun to shake when she washed the linens brought from town. Naomi worked through the night, boiling water, scrubbing until the skin on her knuckles split. "Stay away from the river," she told Iris one morning, voice raw from worry. "Don't go near it, not even to look." But Iris couldn't keep away. At dusk she returned, drawn by habit and something deeper, a strange stillness that felt almost alive. The river was lower now, its surface dark and sluggish. When she leaned closer, she thought she saw something moving beneath, a pale shimmer like light trapped under glass. A low rumble rolled across the sky, thunder, then another. Back in town, Reverend Bell stood on the church steps, watching clouds gather like bruises over the horizon. "The Lord sends his warnings in threes," he told his parishioners. "First the drought, then the fever, next comes the cleansing." That night, the storm broke. Rain came down in violent sheets, flooding the fields, filling the air with the scent of mud and salt. Naomi barred the door and pulled Iris close. "Don't listen to it," she said over the wind. "It's just water talking." But Iris did listen, and through the roar of thunder she thought she heard the river breathing her name again, softer now, closer. When the storm passed, Fairgrove was left in ruins of mud and silence. The river had risen high enough to swallow the lower fields, and bits of driftwood, broken fences and uprooted reeds littered the banks. For days the air smelled of wet earth and something faintly metallic like rust. Iris watched the floodwaters recede from her window. The world looked washed clean, yet heavier somehow. Naomi forbade her from stepping outside. "Not till the ground remembers how to hold you," she'd said, but Iris still crept out when her mother's back was turned. The river had changed. It ran slower now, wider, its surface dull and glassy, as though it were tired too. That was when she found it. A blue ribbon, tangled in the reeds, its colour dimmed by mud. Iris knew it at once. The same ribbon Annie Bell wore in her hair the day they first met. She picked it up carefully, smoothing it between her fingers, and tied it loosely around her wrist. She meant to return it. But the next few days brought more rain, and Naomi kept her locked inside. In town, whispers grew louder. Reverend Bell had taken to visiting the sick daily, praying at every bedside. His sermons had turned to talk of marks and temptations, and when someone mentioned that the pale child had been seen near the water again, the Reverend's voice went cold. "Some storms don't come from heaven. Some are born from what walks among us." Annie, restless after the storm, begged her mother to let her play outside. She wandered near the edge of town, her shoes still sinking in wet clay. That's when she saw Iris. Iris stood by the river, half hidden by reeds, humming softly. The blue ribbon now circled her pale hair like a crown. Annie ran to her, delighted. "You found it!" she cried. Iris turned, startled, then smiled faintly. "It was waiting for you." But before Annie could take it back, her mother's voice called from the path. "Annie Bell, get away from her!" The words struck the air like a whip. Annie froze. Her mother's face appeared through the fog, pale, furious, afraid. She grabbed her daughter's hand and pulled her close, glaring at Iris. "You keep what's yours, girl." "We don't want it back." Iris lowered her eyes, ashamed, though she didn't know why. The ribbon slipped from her fingers, landing in the mud between them. Annie looked back once, her small hand lifting in a silent apology before she was dragged away. Naomi found Iris sitting by the doorway that evening, her dress damp, her hands clasped in her lap. "What happened?" she asked. Iris shook her head. "I tried to give something back, but they didn't want it outside." The storm clouds gathered again, smaller this time, but darker, like the sky itself was keeping a grudge. Naomi had never gone to the parsonage alone before. The idea of standing beneath that roof, the one that had judged her from a distance for years, made her hands tremble. But whispers had teeth now, and they were closing in around Iris. Something had to be done before the wrong person listened too long. She arrived just after noon, when the light was at its harshest. Reverend Bell was in his study, his sleeves rolled up, sorting through sermons and ledgers. The air smelled of ink and dust and something faintly bitter, candle smoke maybe. He looked up when she entered, expression unreadable. "Mrs. Whitlow," he said slowly, "to what do I owe your visit?" Naomi kept her eyes down. "It's about my daughter, Reverend." He gestured for her to sit, though she didn't. "Go on." "There's talk," she said, "about Iris. People are saying things that ain't right. They say she's different. You know how this town can be. I was hoping maybe you could speak on it Sunday, say she's just a child, that she means no harm." The Reverend leaned back, folding his hands. "Mrs. Whitlow," he said, "Fairgrove is a place that minds the Lord's order. When that order is disturbed, fear takes root. I cannot tell my flock to close their eyes to what the Lord himself may be showing them." Naomi's heart thudded in her chest. "You think my child's a warning?" He didn't answer right away. "Some are born as reminders," he said finally, "of what happens when man forgets his place. I don't question God's lessons." Naomi stepped forward, voice rising despite herself. "She's 9 years old, Reverend. She don't even know what sin means." His eyes hardened. "Then you should teach her before it's too late." Something inside Naomi cracked. Not a sound, just a feeling, a small break deep enough to let fear flood in. She turned and left without another word. Outside, the wind had shifted, carrying the smell of river mud and rain. The first clouds of a new storm were forming on the horizon. When she reached the cottage, Iris was sitting by the window, drawing in the condensation. "Mama," she said softly, "why does everyone in town pray so loud now?" Naomi knelt beside her, taking her small hands. "Because they're scared," she said. "Of what?" "Of anything that don't look like them." Iris tilted her head. "Then they'll always be scared, won't they?" Naomi didn't answer. She brushed the child's pale hair from her face and whispered, "Promise me you'll stay near the house." Iris nodded, but that night, when the moon rose over the marsh, she was gone again, drawn back to the only place that ever answered her kindly. The sun was sinking low, staining the sky the color of rust and fading ember. The river lay still beneath it, wide and dark as glass, holding its breath between tides. That evening, the world felt paused, quiet, heavy, waiting. Annie Bell slipped out through the parsonage gate while her parents prayed over supper. Barefoot, carrying a small lantern, she followed the familiar path down toward the marsh. She wasn't afraid. The stories her father told about curses and sin sounded small out here, drowned out by crickets and the gentle pull of the river's voice. She found Iris sitting on a fallen log, knees pulled to her chest, staring at the reflection of the dying light. "I thought you weren't coming back," Iris said softly, without turning. "My mama says you're bad luck," Annie replied, breathless from running, "but I don't think that's true." Iris smiled faintly. "People say the river's bad luck too." "Then I guess we're the same," Annie said. She knelt beside her and set the lantern down between them. Its flickering glow painted their faces gold, one flushed and rosy, the other pale and ghost-like. Two sides of the same flame. They played a small game, tossing pebbles, counting how many skips before they sank. Annie laughed every time she beat Iris, and Iris laughed too, though her laughter sounded almost startled, as if she wasn't sure she was allowed to make that sound. When the wind changed, Iris lifted her face to it. "Do you ever wish you could live in the water?" she asked. "Down where it's quiet?" Annie frowned. "You'd drown." "Maybe," Iris said, "but maybe it'd be like falling asleep and never having to wake up." Annie didn't understand, but she reached out anyway, taking Iris's hand. "You could come to church again," she said earnestly. "If you sat next to me, no one would whisper." Iris shook her head. "They'd whisper louder." Thunder rumbled somewhere beyond the horizon, soft at first, then rolling like a growl through the marsh. The lantern flickered, and Annie squeezed Iris's hand. "I should go," she whispered. "Will you come back?" Annie hesitated. "If Papa doesn't catch me." Iris smiled again, smaller this time. "Then I'll wait." As Annie ran back toward the path, Iris turned back to the water. For a moment, she thought she saw two reflections in the river, herself and another child's face just behind her shoulder. But when she blinked, it was gone. In the distance, the first church bell began to toll, long, hollow and slow, echoing through the darkening fields. and by the time the sound faded, Annie Bell was already missing. By dawn, the marsh had turned grey again. The air smelled of rain that hadn't come yet, heavy, sour, waiting. From her window, Naomi Whitlow watched 3 men ride down the dirt road toward the river. They didn't speak. Men in Fairgrove never spoke when they were riding toward trouble. Naomi stepped outside, the hem of her dress catching on the wet grass. "What's happened?" she asked the miller's wife, who stood at her fence with her arms crossed tight. "They're looking for the Bell girl," the woman said. "Annie. Didn't come home last night." Naomi felt the world go hollow for a moment. "Did they check the church?" "They checked everywhere." The woman hesitated, then lowered her voice. "Somebody said she was seen with your Iris by the water yesterday." The words struck harder than a slap. Naomi didn't answer. She just turned and ran back to the cottage. Inside, Iris was still half asleep, her hair tangled, her feet muddy from the night before. "Mama," she mumbled. Naomi knelt beside her, gripping her shoulders. "Tell me where you went." "I was by the river," Iris said, blinking. "Annie came to see me. We threw stones. Did you see where she went?" Iris hesitated, her mouth trembling. She said she was going home. Naomi's hands shook. "Did anyone else see you two?" The girl shook her head slowly. "Only the river." Outside, the shouts began, voices calling Annie's name, dogs barking, men splashing through the reeds. Naomi pulled Iris close. "Listen to me," she said, voice sharp with fear. "You don't go outside." "Not for anything. You stay here till I come back. But, Mama—" "Do what I say." Naomi wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and stepped into the mist. She followed the sound of the men's voices until she reached the riverbank. The water had receded again, leaving patches of soft mud and a trail of footprints that led down to the reeds. Small prints, a child's. One of the men pointed. "There," he said. "Only one set coming back." Another man knelt beside the prints. "Barefoot," he muttered. "Reckon it's the Whitlow girl. Ain't no other child in town who goes around without shoes." Naomi's mouth went dry. "You don't know that," she said. "Annie plays down here all the time." Reverend Bell appeared through the fog then, his black coat shining wet with dew. He didn't look at Naomi, only at the river. "The Lord knows what's been done," he said softly, "and he'll show us soon enough." A single torn scrap of blue fabric clung to a cattail near the bank, fluttering weakly in the wind. That evening, as the sun sank red behind the marsh, the bell in Fairgrove tolled once, slow and deep, a sound like mourning, and in every house, people whispered the same name under their breath, the Whitlow girl. By the 3rd day, the whispers had become a pulse beneath the skin of Fairgrove, steady, fevered, and unstoppable. The search for Annie Bell had turned from grief to accusation, and her name now carried another, Iris Whitlow. People gathered outside the church, their faces tight with fear and righteousness. The men spoke in low tones, the women clutching their children close as if purity could be caught like a chill. No one said the word mob, but that's what it was. Reverend Bell stood before them, his Bible pressed against his chest like a weapon. His voice carried through the damp air, deep and shaking with conviction. "The Lord tests his flock," he said, "and when one among us invites darkness, it is not mercy to ignore it." Naomi heard him from the edge of the crowd. Her apron was still damp from the wash basin, her face pale but set. She wanted to scream, to tell them that her daughter was no witch, no curse, no omen, just a lonely child who didn't belong anywhere. But every face she saw was hungry for belief. At home, Iris sat on the floor beside the window, clutching her doll, a bundle of rags and buttons her mother had made. The cottage felt smaller that day, the air inside heavy and listening. When Naomi burst through the door, her hands shook so hard she nearly dropped the latch. "You don't open that door," she said, breathless. "You don't move. Do you understand?" Iris nodded, her grey eyes wide. "Did they find Annie?" Naomi didn't answer. She lit a single candle and pulled the curtains tight. "They're looking for someone to blame," she whispered. "And it's easier to blame what they already fear." Outside, boots crunched over the wet earth. Voices rose and fell, searching, demanding, circling. Someone threw a stone at the side of the house. It hit the wall with a dull thud. Naomi blew out the candle. The darkness was safer. A knock came then. Not the kind that asked permission, but the kind that claimed right. The voice on the other side was Reverend Bell's. "Mrs. Whitlow," he called, calm and cold. "Bring out the girl." Let her speak her truth. Naomi's heart pounded. She whispered to Iris, "Go to the cellar. Stay quiet. But Mama." Now. Iris disappeared into the dark, the trapdoor closing softly behind her. Naomi stood by the door, hand trembling on the latch. "My child's asleep," she said through the wood. "Then God will wake her," Bell replied. The door shuddered under another knock, louder this time, and Naomi knew it wouldn't be the last. Outside, thunder gathered low over the marsh, rolling like an answer no one wanted to hear. By morning, the path to the Whitlow cottage was marked with footprints, deep, clustered, impatient. The town of Fairgrove had decided to come for answers. Naomi knew it before she saw them. She heard them first, the sound of boots in wet earth, voices thick with prayer and anger. She opened the door before they could knock again. Better to face them than let them break their way in. Reverend Bell stood at the front of the crowd, his Bible tucked under one arm, his hat dripping from the mist. Behind him were half a dozen men from town, farmers, mill hands, fathers, all wearing the same look of weary righteousness. "Mrs. Whitlow," the Reverend began, "you've heard the rumors." "I've heard lies," she said. Bell's expression didn't change. "My daughter is missing. Witnesses saw your child with her at the river before the storm. We only ask that you bring the girl forward, that we might know the truth." Naomi's voice trembled but didn't break. "My child's no witch, Reverend. She's no curse. She's a child, same as your Annie," the crowd murmured. A woman near the back spat the word unnatural. Another crossed herself. Bell stepped closer. "Then let her speak. If she's innocent, she has nothing to fear." Naomi took a step back. "You won't twist her words into something they're not." "Words don't lie," he said. "The devil does." The sound of that word, devil, spread through the crowd like a spark in dry straw. Naomi could feel the air shift. It wasn't grief anymore. It was hunger, the kind that comes from needing someone to carry your sins for you. Inside the cottage, beneath the floorboards, Iris pressed her hands to her ears. The voices above blurred together, fragments of her name, her mother's pleading tone, the sharp edge of the Reverend's fury. She could hear the tremor in Naomi's breath even through the wood. Then something crashed. The table knocked aside as someone forced their way in. Iris crawled deeper into the darkness, clutching her doll to her chest. Through the thin slats, she saw boots, skirts, flickering lamplight. Reverend Bell's voice came again, calm but cold. "You've hidden her long enough, Naomi. The Lord sees what we conceal. If you love your child, you'll let her face his judgment." Naomi's answer came out like a growl. "My God wouldn't let a crowd decide what's holy." The Reverend's gaze hardened. "Then perhaps yours isn't the same as ours." The silence that followed was worse than the shouting had been. Then, slowly, the crowd began to leave, but not out of mercy. It was the quiet of people who had already decided what would come next. When they were gone, Naomi dropped to her knees beside the trapdoor and whispered, "Don't be afraid, Iris." "We'll leave tonight above them." The sky had gone the color of lead. The air felt swollen, too still. The marsh wasn't breathing anymore. Something was about to break. That night, the marsh swallowed all sound. Even the crickets seemed to know what was coming. Naomi moved through the dark with a small bundle tied to her back, food, matches, a change of clothes, and her daughter's trembling hand locked in her own. "Don't let go," she whispered. Iris didn't answer, only nodded, her grey eyes catching what little moonlight filtered through the trees. They slipped past the last of the fence posts, through tall grass wet with dew. Behind them, the church bell began to toll. 1, 2, 3, each strike slower than the last. a warning. Naomi didn't look back. The path through the marsh was barely a path at all, more memory than road. She'd walked it once years ago before Iris was born, back when she'd thought freedom was something you could hold in your hands. Tonight, it was the only way left to disappear. The reeds brushed against them like whispering hands. The mud pulled at their feet. Somewhere far off, a dog barked, then another. Naomi froze, her breath sharp. She could hear voices, faint but moving closer, echoing through the mist. "They're looking for us," Iris whispered. Naomi squeezed her hand. "They won't find us." Lightning flashed across the horizon, a brief white glow that turned the marsh silver. For an instant, Naomi saw everything: the black water, the cypress trees, her child's pale face shining like a ghost. Then darkness again. They reached the shallows where the land met the wider river. The air there was thick and cold. Naomi crouched beside Iris. "We'll rest here a moment," she said. Iris looked out over the water, calm despite her shaking. "It's not angry tonight," she said. Naomi frowned. "What do you mean?" "It doesn't sound mad anymore." Naomi opened her mouth to speak, but stopped. The girl was right. The river was too quiet, like it was listening. She drew Iris close and whispered a prayer she barely remembered. "Lord, deliver us from the eyes of men who see devils where you put children." In the distance, voices rose again, shouts carried by the wind. The glow of lanterns flickered through the trees. Naomi stood, her fear snapping back into motion. "We can't stop now." She lifted Iris into her arms and waded deeper into the marsh, the cold water biting at her legs. Every step was slower, heavier. "Mama," Iris whispered, her voice barely a breath. "The river says to hurry." And then, a crack of thunder. The lantern light behind them flared and disappeared into fog. Naomi kept moving, not daring to turn around. By the time the shouting faded, only the river's breath remained, slow, steady, patient, waiting. They found the shed just before dawn, a slanting shape half swallowed by vines, tucked behind a curtain of willows near the river's bend. Its roof sagged, and one wall leaned inward as though it were listening to the ground, but it was dry inside, and that was enough. Naomi pushed the door open, the rusted hinges moaning softly. Inside smelled of rotted rope and wet wood. A tangle of fishing nets hung from the rafters like cobwebs. She brushed them aside and guided Iris in first. "You'll stay here," Naomi whispered, "just till I find food." Iris nodded, but didn't sit. Her bare feet made no sound on the dirt floor. "Is it safe?" she asked. Naomi forced a smile. "It's safe for now." She wrapped her shawl around the girl's shoulders and crouched so their faces were level. "Listen to me, Iris. If you hear voices, if you see lantern light, you don't make a sound, not a breath. You wait till I come back, you understand?" Iris nodded again, but her eyes drifted toward the gap in the wall where a sliver of river shimmered. "Will you come back before dark?" "I'll come back before you can count 100, Naomi said. She smoothed her daughter's hair once, tender and trembling, then slipped out into the pale mist. The door closed behind her with a sound too soft to be reassuring. Iris waited. She sat in the corner, wrapping her arms around her knees, counting in whispers that barely left her lips. The world outside was hushed, except for the slow lap of water and the distant cries of birds waking to morning. After a while, she stopped counting. She picked up a piece of driftwood and began tracing circles in the dirt, big ones at first, then smaller, tighter, until they folded into one another like ripples. The light through the cracks shifted from grey to gold, then faded again. The air grew heavy with evening. Naomi hadn't returned. Hunger came first, then the ache of waiting. Iris lay down on the dirt floor and watched the dust turn to fireflies in the last light. She could almost hear her mother's voice, gentle and worn. "Don't listen to what they call you. Listen to what loves you." But when the wind rose, carrying the faint echo of shouts through the marsh, she realized the voices were real. Men. Dogs. The search. Iris crawled toward the door and peered through the cracks. Lanterns bobbed in the distance like floating stars. For a moment she thought she saw her mother among them, a small figure wading through reeds, calling her name. She pressed her face to the wall, heart hammering. "Mama," she whispered. No answer came, only the steady sigh of the river as if it were trying to hush her. The search began at first light. By then, the river had turned grey again, its reflection broken by the soft drag of oars and lanterns. The men from Fairgrove moved in silence, a grim kind of silence, the kind that had already decided what it would find. Reverend Bell rode at the front, his black coat streaked with mud, his Bible tucked under one arm like a compass that always pointed toward guilt. They followed the dogs first, thin, restless animals straining at their leashes, noses pressed to the ground. The tracks led downriver through reeds and shallow mud to the stretch where the trees thickened and the air turned still. The old fishing shed stood there, barely upright, its door hanging crooked. "There," one of the men said. The Reverend lifted his lantern. The light trembled on the warped boards. "Go on," he told them. The door creaked open. Inside, crouched in the shadows, was Iris Whitlow. Her hair was tangled with straw, her dress streaked with dirt. Her eyes were wide but strangely calm, the look of someone who'd been waiting to be found. In her lap was a small, water-warped doll. She held it like it might still be warm. "Child," Reverend Bell said, stepping forward. "Where is your mother?" Iris blinked slowly. "She went to find Annie." The men glanced at one another. The Reverend's voice sharpened. "You mean she left you here?" Iris looked at the ground. "She said she'd come back. Did she tell you where she went?" Iris shook her head. "She said the river would know." The Reverend's jaw tightened. He motioned for 2 men to check the bank. "Search the water," he ordered. "If Naomi Whitlow's sins didn't drown her, we'll find her footprints soon enough." One man lingered, looking at the child. "Maybe we should take her back to town first." Bell turned, his face hardening in the lantern light. "No. She stays until we know what's been done." Iris didn't cry. She only stared at the open door, watching the fog move in like a curtain. The men's lanterns bobbed away, small suns in the distance. Inside the shed, the Reverend knelt before her. "Do you know what happens to souls who lie, Iris?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "They get lost." He studied her face, so pale it seemed to glow in the dimness. "And where do lost souls go?" She looked up then, and for a heartbeat, her eyes caught the lantern's reflection, 2 silver mirrors staring straight into his. "They go where people stop looking for them." The Reverend recoiled slightly, a flicker of unease crossing his face. He stood abruptly and turned toward the men returning from the river. "Nothing," one of them called. "No body, just her shawl, caught in the reeds." Reverend Bell's expression went grim. "Then the Lord's already judged her." He turned back to Iris. "Take the child," he said. "She'll speak before the church." And as they led her out into the dawn, the first light touched the water, pale, cold, and perfectly still. They brought Iris back to Fairgrove at dusk, her small figure swallowed by the crowd that trailed behind. The church doors were open, and candles lined the aisle like a path meant to guide the condemned. The scent of wax and damp wood clung to the air. Reverend Bell stood at the pulpit, his voice carrying over the murmurs. "We gather in grief," he said, "but also in duty. The Lord sees what man would ignore. We cannot let darkness walk unchallenged among us." Iris stood before him, barefoot, her dress still stained with marsh water. Her eyes, those strange silvery eyes, didn't rise to meet his. She stared instead at the flame of a single candle near her feet, watching it sway in the draughts that moved through the church. Someone from the back spoke. "She was seen near the river that night." "That's proof enough," another voice answered. "She's cursed." The Lord marked her. Naomi wasn't there to defend her. The men had refused to let her go with the search party, saying, "Truth comes cleaner from a child." Iris stood alone, smaller than anyone remembered, framed by shadows and candlelight. Reverend Bell raised a hand, and the noise fell away. "Child," he said, his tone soft now, almost kind. Tell us what you did by the river." Iris looked up. "I was waiting for my mama. And before that, I was playing with Annie." The Reverend's eyes narrowed. "And what happened to her?" Iris hesitated. "She went home." "She never reached it," he said quietly. "Do you know why?" Iris's voice trembled. The river was high that night. It was pulling hard. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Belle took a step closer. "Are you saying the river took her?" "I don't know," Iris whispered. "It listens to people. Sometimes it keeps them." That simple line was enough. The crowd shifted, a low growl of agreement rising. Someone muttered, "She speaks with it." Another said, "The river answers her." Reverend Bell turned to his flock. "You see, even the child confesses. She communes with what is not of God." Iris flinched at the sound of her name twisting in his mouth. She tried to speak again, but the noise drowned her. Shouts, sobs, the scrape of benches. The storm that had started in whispers had finally found its voice. Bell looked out over them, his hand trembling slightly on the pulpit. "We will not harm her," he said, "but she cannot remain among us. She will be kept until the Lord's will is revealed." The words carried the sound of mercy, but none of its meaning. As they led her down to the cellar beneath the church, Iris turned once toward the open door. Beyond the threshold, the night was waiting, still and grey, and somewhere out in that darkness the river sighed. It had taken what it wanted, but it wasn't finished yet. 3 days after Iris was locked beneath the church, a fisherman found something caught in the reeds. At first, he thought it was a bundle of wet linen, until the current shifted and a pale hand rose briefly above the water before sinking again. They brought the body to shore at dawn. Naomi Whitlow. Her shawl was gone, her hair tangled with river grass, her eyes half open as if she'd been looking for someone in her last moment. The water had been kind to her, softening the bruises, washing away whatever pain she'd carried in her lungs. Reverend Bell was there when they lifted her from the bank. He bowed his head, but did not pray. "The river keeps its own counsel," he said quietly. "God's judgment moves as it must." By noon, the story had already twisted. Some said Naomi had drowned herself out of guilt. Others whispered she'd tried to call the river back to undo what her daughter had done. No one mentioned fear or mercy, only punishment. When the Reverend's wife asked whether the child should be told, Bell shook his head. "The Lord's truth will reach her in His time." Not before. So Iris never learned. She sat in the church cellar, a thin blanket around her shoulders, listening to the sounds above her, footsteps, voices, the scrape of chairs. Sometimes she thought she heard her mother calling her name through the cracks in the floorboards, soft and low, like a lullaby wrapped in water. At night, the Reverend came down with a lantern to watch her. He never spoke much, only stood in the doorway and studied her as though waiting for her to change. Once, he asked if she'd prayed for her mother. "I don't think God listens to me," Iris said. Bell frowned. "Then perhaps you've not been praying to the right one." He left without another word. In the dark, Iris traced her finger along the dirt floor, spelling her mother's name letter by letter. When she finished, she whispered, "She's still with the river." And the river, patient and endless, seemed to whisper back, a sound like a sigh pressed against the walls of the earth. Outside, Fairgrove slept uneasy. The fever had finally faded, the fields were drying, and yet no one thanked heaven for it. Instead, they kept glancing toward the water, afraid of the quiet, afraid of what the silence might mean. By the week's end, no one spoke Naomi Whitlow's name anymore, but the river remembered. It always did. The cellar beneath the church was little more than a square of stone and dirt, cold even in summer. Iris sat on a small stool near the wall, tracing circles in the dust with her finger. She had stopped asking when she could go home. There was no one left to answer her. The Reverend's wife, Margaret Bell, had begun visiting her in secret. She brought food wrapped in cloth and small things she thought might comfort a child: a comb, a scrap of ribbon, a small wooden cross. She meant it as kindness, but her visits were shadowed by something else: guilt. Margaret was a quiet woman, gentle in voice but bound by fear. Every night she heard her husband pray louder, his words edged with something that no longer sounded like faith. And every night she thought about the pale girl in the cellar, a child she'd seen play with her daughter by the water, a child now locked away like sin given skin. That evening, when she came down the narrow steps, Iris was humming softly. The tune was broken, uncertain, but familiar, the same hymn the Reverend led each Sunday. Margaret stopped at the bottom step, her voice trembling. "Where did you learn that song?" Iris didn't look up. "Annie used to hum it." Margaret's breath caught. "You knew Annie?" Iris nodded. "She liked the river too." For a long moment the woman said nothing. She set down the bundle of bread and water she carried, then crouched to meet the girl's eyes. "Do you know where she went, Iris?" The child blinked slowly. "She went quiet." Margaret swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" Iris tilted her head, her pale hair falling over her face. "When people stop calling your name, you fade. That's what the river told me." The words made the woman's skin prickle. She tried to smile, but it came out strained. "You shouldn't say things like that, child." "I'm just repeating what it said," Iris murmured, her voice soft, too soft. "You talk to it too, don't you?" "When no one hears you." Margaret stepped back, her knees unsteady. "I pray," she said. "I pray to God." Iris's eyes met hers then, and something in the girl's expression made Margaret's heart falter. It wasn't anger or sorrow. It was stillness. "I can hear your prayers," Iris said quietly. "You ask him to forgive your husband. But he doesn't answer, does he?" The air in the cellar seemed to sink. Margaret stumbled backward, clutching the railing. You mustn't repeat such things." "I don't repeat," Iris whispered. "I remember." The woman fled, her skirts brushing the walls as she climbed the steps. She didn't look back. That night, she told her husband what had happened. She said, "The child speaks in borrowed voices." Reverend Bell closed his Bible slowly. "Evil repeats what is pure," he said, "and that too must be silenced." Outside, the church bell swayed in the wind, but no one rang it. The sound it made was hollow, a breath caught between heaven and the river. By the end of the week, Fairgrove no longer spoke of the fever, the harvest, or even Annie Bell. Every conversation led back to one name: Iris Whitlow. The Reverend called a meeting inside the church. No sermon this time, no hymns. Just a gathering of faces lit by candlelight, shadows leaning long across the pews. The air smelled of smoke and damp wood, and the murmur of voices hummed like a hive. Reverend Bell stood at the pulpit, his hands gripping the edge as though holding himself steady. His wife sat in the front row, pale and silent, her eyes fixed on the floor. "My friends," the Reverend began, his voice low but hard enough to carry, "we have shown patience. We have offered prayer. Yet evil lingers still among us, unrepentant, mocking, and clothed in the form of innocence." A murmur rippled through the room. He went on. "I have heard her speak things no child should know. She repeats prayers she's never been taught. She knows the weight of sin, yet feels no fear of it." He paused, letting the silence build like pressure. "This is not ignorance. It is influence," someone shouted from the back. "So what do we do?" Reverend Bell's gaze swept the crowd. "We do what God commands. We cast out what he has not made." Gasps, nods, the rustle of agreement. Fear is a quick teacher. Margaret Bell stood then, trembling. "She's only a child," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "You said yourself, God tests us. What if this is the test?" Her husband's eyes turned to her, heavy with the weight of the room. "The test," he said slowly, "is whether we obey." Margaret sat down. The candles flickered, throwing her shadow across the wall behind her, long, bent, and trembling. By the time the meeting ended, the decision had already been made. They would send the child away. No one said where, only that it would be somewhere fitting. The words hung like smoke, leaving no trace of mercy. Outside, the night pressed against the windows. The townspeople dispersed quietly, their lanterns swinging through the fog like tiny suns retreating into darkness. Reverend Bell lingered alone in the church. He walked to the altar, placed his hand on the open Bible and whispered, "Lord, take this burden from us. Let her silence be your sign." But he didn't notice his wife standing in the doorway behind him, tears streaking her face. She knew the look in his eyes, not faith, not peace. It was conviction without kindness. Down in the cellar, Iris sat awake. She hadn't eaten since morning. She stared at the small wooden cross Margaret had brought her days before, turning it over in her hands. Above her, muffled voices drifted through the floorboards. One phrase came clear enough to understand: tomorrow. That night, Iris waited until the voices stopped, until even the candles above her burned out. Then she slipped her small hand into the crack beneath the door and felt the air. It smelled of river water. She rose quietly, and for the first time since her mother's death, she smiled. The moon hung low over Fairgrove that night, pale and swollen, its reflection spilling across the marsh like spilled milk. The town slept, or pretended to. Behind shuttered windows, people whispered prayers they no longer believed would be answered. Only one door moved in the stillness, the cellar door beneath the church. Iris Whitlow slipped out barefoot, the wooden cross clenched tight in her hand. The air outside was cool and damp, heavy with the scent of rain that never came. She didn't look back toward the church. She didn't need to. The building's shadow stretched long behind her, chasing her down the road until the mist swallowed it whole. She walked the path she knew best, the one that led to the water. The marsh hummed softly around her, frogs and crickets murmuring like a tired choir. The ground was slick, sucking at her heels, but she didn't stop. The river had always called her gently before, like a friend. Tonight, its voice was louder, urgent. When she reached the bank, the world fell quiet again. The river spread out before her, black, shining, endless. She crouched at its edge, her reflection rippling in the current. "I came back," she whispered. "You were right." They stopped saying my name. The water moved, slow and deliberate, folding light into shadow. She thought she saw her mother there, Naomi's face beneath the surface, eyes open, lips soft with forgiveness. But when she blinked, it was gone. Only her own reflection stared back, pale, thin, and no longer afraid. Iris pressed the wooden cross to her chest. "If I go quiet too," she said softly, "will you stop being angry?" A faint sound rose from the current, almost like a sigh. Behind her, far away, the church bell began to ring, not the slow toll of mourning this time, but frantic, uneven. Someone had found the door open. Someone knew she was gone. She stepped closer to the edge, the mud cold between her toes. The wind lifted her hair like pale smoke. "It's all right," she murmured, as if to the water or to herself. "You can keep me too." She took one last breath of the marsh air, that strange mix of sweetness and decay, and stepped forward. The river didn't take her violently. It received her. The surface broke soundlessly, ripples spreading like whispers. For a moment, the moon caught her reflection, two faces flickering together, one above, one below, and then the water smoothed over, calm as glass. By the time the lanterns appeared on the path, the current had already carried her downstream. And when Reverend Bell reached the riverbank, panting and furious, the only thing left behind was a small wooden cross, half buried in the mud. The water lapped gently at his boots, as if it were mocking him, or forgiving him. He couldn't tell which. When dawn came to Fairgrove, it came without birdsong. The air was still, grey and damp, the kind of morning that felt like the world was holding its breath. Reverend Bell stood at the river's edge, the hem of his coat soaked in mud, his eyes fixed on the slow-moving water. The others had joined him by then, a handful of men, a few women clutching their shawls. The dogs refused to go near the river, whining and pulling against their leashes. One of the men spoke first. "You think she drowned?" The Reverend didn't answer right away. He bent down and picked something out of the mud, a small wooden cross, slick with river water. He held it up to the light. "The Lord's hand is in this," he said finally. "He's taken what was his to judge." Margaret Bell stood a few steps behind him, her hands trembling. "She was just a child," she whispered. Her husband turned to her, his eyes red-rimmed from exhaustion or something deeper. "No," he said quietly. "Children are born of innocence." This one was born of defiance. The river gave a long sigh, its current tugging weakly at the shore. By mid-morning, word had spread. The Whitlow girl was gone, taken, they said, by the same water that had swallowed her mother and the Reverend's own daughter. No one dared call it coincidence. They called it justice. Some came to the church that afternoon, bringing offerings, candles, coins, dried flowers, laid at the altar not in mourning, but in thanks. The fever had not returned, and the harvest that week came easier than it had in years. People whispered that the curse had been lifted. Only Margaret couldn't bring herself to pray. When she looked at the river, she didn't see wrath or salvation. She saw a small hand reaching toward her in silence. That night, the Reverend sat alone in his study, the candle burning low. The wooden cross lay on the table before him. He stared at it until his eyes blurred. Somewhere beyond the churchyard, the river gurgled softly, almost like laughter. He closed his eyes and whispered a prayer that sounded more like a confession. "Lord, if I was wrong." But he didn't finish the sentence. The next morning, the cross was gone. The window above his desk stood open, the curtains damp with river mist. Fairgrove didn't search for Iris again. Her name was spoken only in hushed tones, as if saying it aloud might wake something they'd buried in silence. And as the years went on, the story changed. She became a shadow in their memory, a warning to children, a ghost in the reeds, a whisper in the current. But the river kept her name. It said it softly, again and again, like a lullaby no one wanted to hear. Time moved differently in Fairgrove after that summer. The fever never returned, the harvests grew kinder, and the river, once feared, went quiet. The town began to heal, or at least it learned how to pretend. Years passed, and the Whitlow cottage was left to rot. Ivy climbed over the broken windows, and reeds grew thick along the path that once led to its door. No one bought the land. Some said the soil refused to take new roots. Others swore they'd heard humming there at dusk, a child's voice, faint and tuneless, drifting through the fog. Children born long after that time still learned the story. Parents told it in low voices as a warning. Don't wander near the water after dark. Don't follow voices you can't see, and never look too long into your reflection. They didn't say Iris Whitlow's name, but everyone knew who the story was about. Sometimes, travelers passing through would ask about the river, why no one fished there, why the townsfolk crossed it only at the narrow bridge upriver. The locals would shrug and say, "It's just the way things are." But their eyes would flicker toward the marsh, unwilling to look for too long. Reverend Bell grew old before his time. His hair greyed, his sermons shortened. He still led his flock, but his voice carried less conviction. On stormy nights, when lightning turned the river white, he could swear he saw two small figures at the edge of the water, one pale, one darker, their hands clasped together. They never moved. He told himself it was the light, that it had to be. His wife, Margaret, stopped going to the church after that autumn. She tended the garden behind their home and never spoke of the cellar again. When she died, they found a folded scrap of linen inside her Bible, a child's ribbon, blue and faded. By then, most of Fairgrove had stopped remembering the details. The story had become shapeless, as stories do. Some said the pale girl had cursed the river. Others said she'd sacrificed herself to cleanse it. Some even said she'd been an angel who wandered too far from heaven and drowned trying to find her way home. But the river didn't care for stories. It flowed on, steady, slow, unbothered. And yet, on certain nights when the air hung thick with mist, the fishermen swore they could hear something in the reeds. A soft, uneven hum. A child's voice, rising and falling with the current. When asked what the song was, one old man said he'd heard it once as a boy. "It ain't a song," he murmured. "It's a name. The river keeps saying it over and over. What name? Someone asked. He looked toward the marsh, eyes gone glassy with memory. Iris, he said. The river never forgot her. In the summer of 1901, nearly half a century after the Whitlow girl vanished, a young woman named Clara Densmore arrived in Fairgrove with a notebook and a question that no one wanted to answer. She was a historian from Baltimore, collecting stories from small river towns, tales of hauntings, curses, and forgotten tragedies. Her mentor had told her, half in jest, "If you go to Fairgrove, don't drink from the river." It was advice that only made her more curious. The town had changed little. The same steeple cut the horizon, the same marsh stretched into the distance, and the same uneasy quiet hung in the air. Locals were polite but brief. They told her there was nothing worth writing about here. But when she mentioned the old river stories, one man looked away too quickly. Clara found the church locked. Through a cracked window she could see pews covered in dust, hymnals gone yellow, and a pulpit scarred by time. The reverend, she learned, had died in his sleep 30 years before. His heart stopped during a thunderstorm. Some said he'd been praying when it happened. At the edge of the graveyard, she found 2 headstones half swallowed by weeds. Naomi Whitlow, 1823 to 1856, and beside it, a smaller stone marked only I.W. The inscription below was almost illegible, but when she traced her fingers across the surface, she could make out 3 faint words. The river keeps. Something in her chest went cold. That evening, she visited the county records office in the next town. There were no birth papers for an Iris Whitlow, no census entries, no death notice, no church baptism. Just one fragile page in a water-stained logbook dated August 1856. Child, female. Brought to Fairgrove Church for questioning. Missing thereafter. Reverend C. Bell presiding. Below that, a single line in a different hand, written weeks later. Mother found deceased. Case closed by will of Providence. Clara sat there for a long time, the paper trembling in her hands. Before leaving Fairgrove, she went to the river at dusk. The air was warm, the water silver in the fading light. She stood there listening, not for ghosts, but for truth. And in the stillness, she thought she heard humming, a child's voice, soft and uncertain, like it was trying to remember the words. She dropped her notebook into her satchel and turned away, but before she left, something glimmered in the mud. A small rusted button, mother of pearl, dulled by time. She picked it up and smiled sadly. "Maybe some stories don't want to stay buried," she whispered. The next morning, Clara boarded the train back to Baltimore. She never wrote about Fairgrove in any of her published work, but years later, her journals would be found filled with sketches of rivers, magnolia petals, and a name written again and again in the margins. Iris. The river looked different now, or maybe the world around it had simply grown tired of remembering. The fields near Fairgrove were long since overgrown, the church roof half collapsed, and the marsh reclaimed by reeds and silence. The only thing that hadn't changed was the water. It still moved at the same slow rhythm, breathing in and out, like something alive and unhurried. On quiet mornings, when the mist rose low and silver, the river didn't seem to belong to any time at all. It was as though every name it had ever been given, cursed, holy, haunted, had washed away, leaving only what it had always been, a mirror. People still came now and then, a fisherman setting his net too close to the bend, a traveller passing through, drawn by the shape of the land. They would stand at the edge, listening to the hush between the reeds, and swear they heard voices. A child's hum, a woman's whisper, but when they looked around, there was never anyone there, only ripples, spreading softly, as if someone unseen had just stepped into the water. The locals said the river had 2 keepers, a mother and her pale child. They didn't harm anyone. They only watched. They were the quiet that came after every storm, the forgiveness that followed every sin. Sometimes when the moon was full and the tide low, the surface turned smooth as glass. On those nights, if you looked long enough, you might see them. 2 figures standing ankle-deep in silver, holding hands. One dark-haired, one light, both still as reflections that forgot which side of the water they belonged to. And if you whispered a name into that stillness, any name, even your own, the river would answer, softly at first, then fading until it became just another breath in the endless hush of the marsh. The old people in Fairgrove said the river remembers everyone. It just remembers some more gently than others. By dawn, the fog would lift, and the water would look ordinary again, brown, slow, harmless. The fields would hum with crickets, and the world would forget what it saw. But the river would not. Because somewhere beneath the reflection, beneath years and silt and story, two voices still lingered in the dark, a lullaby, a promise, a prayer. They stopped saying our names, but we remember each other. And then the current would take it, rolling the words downstream until they were gone. The river never forgets. It only forgives. And that was the story of Iris Whitlow, the girl they called Trouble, who only ever wanted to be seen as something more than a curse. In the end, she didn't haunt Fairgrove, she forgave it. And maybe that's what makes her story the most haunting of all. Because some ghosts don't linger to frighten us. They linger to be remembered. If this story stayed with you, if you felt the weight of silence, of misunderstanding, of what happens when fear replaces compassion, then you've just listened to history the way it was never meant to be forgotten. Before you go, make sure you subscribe to the Macabre record, where the echoes of the past still speak, and every story whispers something we were never meant to hear. Tell me in the comments, would you have feared the pale girl by the river, or tried to understand her?